Death. It's something we'll all come to know someday. It is the final test, the final rite of passage that we all must face alone. But what if someone could offer you a cheat sheet to that final test? What if you didn't have to take the test at all? John has found himself 50 feet underground in a state-of-the-art facility led by a fringe group who have an obsession with the afterlife and a certain kind of immortality. Though John may not be aware just yet, he is about to embark on the most unusual adventure that extends beyond his body and mind. The whirring of the tape began to accelerate until it became a hum. A stillness filled the air, more suffocating than silence. I never really thought about death, at least not in a real way. It just never seemed real to me. It was something characters did, or the old, and I had a lifetime before it became real. And then, just like everything in life, it came at the worst possible time.
Again, what does death mean to you?
I'm not sure. The absence of me? The end of everything. An all-encompassing black void, senseless nothing.
I need you to convince me, John.
Convince you how? Of
that
what?
you understand what will be asked of you. What does death mean to you?
It means no more trees. No more memories to look back on. No more sky to look up at. No more cars. No more people. No more streets or cities. I'll miss all the sound and the smell of the weather about to change. I'll miss everyone I grew up with and never knew. I'll miss knowing what it means to be hungry and to hurt. I'll miss remembering what this meant to me once when I'm someone somewhere else.
Describe it to me, John.
It's black and dark and nothing, I suppose.
Convince me.
It's like staring into a Rothko painting, but one I don't think you'd want to have made. It's something ugly, primal, layers coating layers,
Deeper.
tangled black vine-like veins, pulsing and swarming over each other. The longer my stare lingers, the less I can tell the difference between me and it. It feels like being asleep underwater in a warm and endless lazy river. I have this feeling like I'm floating home.
Are you afraid of dying, John?
I've lost everything I've ever loved. Everyone. I've no family left, and no one I could call who would care what I have to say or how I'm feeling. Not where I've been, nor how bad things have gone. Am I afraid of death? My friend, there were days where I'd gladly welcome it. And now those two have left me. I am afraid of death. I am. I'm terrified of not being who I am anymore. Of losing grasp of everything I've ever known, of waking or being somewhere entirely alien in a body religious man, but I am a spiritual one. Well, that doesn't do much to silence those questions. I came here because I have to know. Because it's worth the gamble. To see. To find.
Do you believe in God, John?
No.
Do you know what our mission is here?
Your website says you offer a blissful transition to the afterlife. Free of fear. Free of
What is it
hospitals.
that you think you are here for, John?
I'm here because I want to.
Why are you really here, John?
Because the only person that ever meant anything to me left behind her entire world for this place. Because if there is a universe in some sci-fi timeline where your claims are true, because I will die lonely. Either way.
And why did she come here?
It started with a sound, a single, solitary tone. At first, it resembled a smoke detector, an innocuous low frequency that seemed to swallow all sound around it, piercing through, collecting, and silencing anything in its path. His eyes were the first to greet the cold, sterile morning. There was a thickness to the air, something malleable that let him know he wasn't alone. His body reacted before his mind could catch up, and he found himself mid-thought as he threw himself out of the bed, gaining his footing only by stumbling over himself first, resorting to outstretching his hands to force some sort of balance in the universe. The door immediately opened, and at this moment, he was only half certain that this wasn't a dream. With all the movements of a sleepwalker, he swayed and bumped his way through the doorway, the impenetrable curtain of an underground labyrinth, parting with each slow-to-glow fluorescent bulb. When they finally all shone in unison, he noticed he wasn't the only silhouette standing in a doorway. There were 4. The lights were too bright to take in more than simple shapes, and he thought as much before the tone stretched into a new sound. This one made the hinges rattle. It was deep and heavy. It vibrated off the porcelain hallways and shook the fabric on his skin. It felt like being sucker punched by a cluster headache. He'd expected his eyes to go dizzy, but not for his knees to buckle. He caught himself, the prospect of falling waking him up entirely now. Please follow the blue line to today's lesson. A phosphorescent blue began to emit from the ground. It moved in a slowly unfurling string of hazy light. It inched past each of the 4. He followed it as it slid along like a serpent on its belly. He was in trance, and would have remained that way if it wasn't for the corner it eventually nipped behind and slipped down. Thankful to have his mind back, his feet went to shuffle off into the hallway, But before he could, the other four had already moved past him in uniform motion. They reminded him of a school of fish, and he followed the last of them. He didn't expect for him to be alone, but he also didn't expect company. After all, what did she have in common with these people? They'd taken at least 2 turns before it dawned on him that he had no breadcrumb trail to lead him back to that room. The light seemed to extinguish itself as soon as his heels had lifted, and there was a new feeling of being lost. Not like a kid would in a shopping center, but how an astronaut might when his tether broke and he was slowly drifting away. He turned his head to see the same unmarked walls that resembled every other wall he'd seen since he'd been down here. His clothes were the same color, and he wondered if soon, so too, would his skin. He turned to see an enormous eyesore of a doorway, cartoonishly ornate and completely out of place. The brass and gold colors staining the pale setting in a remarkably offensive way. Like life, mocking the newly deceased. The room, the ballroom, was something only Jules Verne could imagine. It was domed, a glass structure that revealed a view of some place or thing that could not exist on Earth. No, not the Earth he knew. What lay outside the sphere's windows were impossible to tell. A smoky, shadow-like fluid, swirled in deep purples and green, accented with momentary flashes of blinding light. It illuminated the larger forms for just the briefest of seconds, as the shapes swam and hid around the enclosure. A strange magnetism drew them each to their marks, almost on cue. This natural formation was both distant, yet near one another. The other four, who he had yet to still fully acknowledge as anything more than placeholders, stared ahead in anxious uncertainty. He wondered what this place had meant to them in that moment, and foolishly, like the child he secretly was, attempted to make eye contact, to understand something words couldn't say. When his attention folded back on itself, it was because of the chairs, 5 of them, that created a circle around where they stood now. Without further instruction, the 4 walked in a straight path that led them each to one of the 5 chairs. He stared at the one meant for him and felt like a pet might after seeing their owner again for the first time in years. The unusual pull of it was enough to break the trance he was in. A new rising panic that he could become so removed from himself on command. And how? Even Pavlov's dog needed to be trained. He couldn't squeeze the last of the thought out before its silent retreat. Instead, he found himself watching as the whites of shoes lifted off the ground, an idiosyncratic pattern that all the same kept to a particular rhythm. He met their directional turn with a secret horror, like two cars changing course on a one-way highway. He anticipated the inevitable and felt his body lean back into the chair. It spoke like his imagination, the precursor that selectively generated the better of his thoughts. The voice, or idea, was grey in tone. It slithered around his skull and pulled at his eyes, emerging in bursts only to crawl back behind the walls of his mind. It wasn't familiar, and it didn't feel friendly. And if there was a feeling to it at all, it was indifferent. And then it happened. Imagery, sensations, and memories all at once, folding over one another like the drowning limbs of 1,000 entangled lives. In an instant, he was beneath and a part of an infinite sky. He was 1,000 eyes in the soil, 1,000 minds asleep. The instinct to somehow gain footing quickly being replaced by the sensation of floating. He knew this feeling, a feeling like nothing before, and yet somehow this felt familiar. And there was a push, somewhere deep within him, that unlocked secrets sunken within a collective memory he could not escape. He felt himself falling backwards, through himself, and then, like a rare color or a flavor lost to time, he suddenly recalled everything there was to know about the sensation. And the knowing enveloped his every cell, from the physical to the intangible and the forever. It was death. He had known it before, and he knew, somewhere in him, that he would know it again. Here, in this chair, he was a part of all he was and was not. He was life unfurling and a crawling death. It felt like standing up inside the shadow of himself, a swirling weakness that gave his effervescent body an order to sleep. And he wanted to close his eyes and disappear. But the voice spoke again, like fireworks of indescribable dimensions, exploding in the sky of his mind, the flashing lights in impossible geometry, now cascading into symbols that he knew he would someday be at some point in time. And he felt himself sailing through the sky as he watched from below. But he wasn't alone. He wasn't alone in any form or state. And what felt like an old companion who had never left his side whispered a gentle reminder into his ears. He was everywhere now, innumerable fragments of an indescribable whole, and yet he was never more himself. Though his body, its appearance, and knowable history, the connections it's made, seemed as forgettable and unknowable as a breakfast he had when he was 3. Still, nothing was lost. Yet, the memory of it seemed to be less important to hold on to. He was home, floating along in an endless lazy river of television static. He no longer thought to think. The mind he formerly knew, echoing sentiments of rejoicing, communing, belonging, as it happily dissolved into the ether of time. The chair shook, and suddenly he was repelled, as if crashing through invisible walls that hurled his senses in every direction. He tried in vain to steady, to focus, to latch onto some identical notion of reality, as his being screamed 1,000 cries of deathless terror. He felt himself begin to divide, spilling through further windows of reality, falling, chaotically spinning, helpless. He began to feel his every atom being held onto, as if being pulled, kept, stolen in time. He felt his presence rise through the crevice of all of existence, clawing and gnashing their teeth down on any piece of matter they could keep. He felt portions of a part of himself he'd never known begin to be torn apart. Spurning, deep, carving sensations burrowed somehow deeper into him. His perspective still shifting, now into identifiable colors, shapes, then sound too. He felt the kaleidoscope vision tighten and shift, until the periscopic view he held onto like a cliff's edge went black. It took a minute to realize his eyes were still closed, and when he did, he was hesitant to open them. The sensation itself feeling as inordinary as a plant being forced to pilot a fleshy machine for the first time. And what he saw caused him to shut them just as fast. And he was back. But that hadn't changed what he had seen and felt, and what he now knew. All of that, though like looking at a memory through a tube television, was still very much with him, in his head. It crowded and slithered, wrapped itself around every loose thought in his mind, until he was sure he'd implode from the pressure within. The images still hurtling through his mind's eye. There was no room left to think, and he felt the thing that was his mind begin to grasp for air. Quickly, he began to navigate his thoughts through the firewall. His eyes, he used those to see the chair, so his body could sit, so he didn't have to stand on his legs. Something that belonged to a person, to a human. His mind spiraling, but now along the runway to a safe landing. He began to feel his hands and his limbs again. He moved his tongue and opened his mouth. He'd almost piloted himself neatly back into his shell when it was a burst of light. It exploded in amber from behind the cover of his eyelids. They opened automatically, and his jaw dropped. There, not 10 feet from him, a fiery hellscape of flailing limbs slid off cindered bone and rang out onto the marble floor. The shrillest, unnatural guttural throating of a half-torched tongue emoted created a spiritual violence. It shook him to his core and caused his eyes to tear uncontrollably. The chair went from primal, animalistic tremors to a static, lone fire. And all he could do was stare. Words had yet to return to his tongue, and in their absence, he wailed. He remembered thinking, before he couldn't anymore, against the infinite abyss. He'd never seen the color orange so bright before.